Your grandfather said there is a secret to passing the most difficult tests.
Show me.
Veteran's son was failing every test until the maid's daughter showed him this one secret. The notification buzzed like a fly trapped in a jar, relentless and impossible to ignore. Academic probation notice, the subject line read. Marcus Thompson didn't open it. He didn't have to. He already knew the verdict. Another failed entrance assessment. Another door closing in a city full of doors he couldn't seem to find the handles to. He stood in the narrow kitchenette of a VA-subsidized studio in Portland, one hand on the chipped counter, the other braced against the sink as if the apartment might tilt and throw him. On the fridge, a magnet held a photo from a different life. His father in dress blues, one palm raised in a crisp salute, the other resting on Marcus's shoulder the week he shipped to Afghanistan. The camera had caught a young man who believed tests were things you passed by, trying hard enough. The bowl of cereal on the table had swollen into a pale, cold thing. The TV muttered headlines no one in the room was listening to. Outside the window, the bus coughed and rattled away from the stop, taillights flashing like a heartbeat that wasn't his. Marcus let the probation email slide into the pile with the others. Missed appointments, last warning, final reminder, urgent. Words that sounded like sirens until you heard them too often. A soft knock. He didn't move. Another, a little braver. When the lock clicked open, the cleaning cart's wheel squeaked first, then the small voice that followed it. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson." Clara Rodriguez stood in the doorway, 11 years old and carrying a backpack too large for her and a book too old for most adults. Her mother, Rosa, worked the building's cleaning shift. Clara did homework in the hallway, on the laundry machines, wherever a light was good and a chair could be borrowed. She lifted the book as if offering a truce. "I think you left this in the community room." It wasn't his. Rainer Maria Rilke stared up from the cover. Letters to a young poet. Marcus almost said he didn't have time for poetry. What he didn't have time for, if he was honest, was the silence that came after failing, the one that asked what came next and waited for a real answer. Clara didn't fill the silence. She held the book steady and said, with an earnestness that made him feel older than 28, "My abuelo said there's a secret to passing the hardest tests. It's not about answers, it's about what you decide to see." Something in the room shifted. No breeze, just a recalibration, like a compass needle freed from metal. For the first time that morning, Marcus looked at her. "Show me," he said. Portland was a city of contradictions. On the east side, where chain-link fences framed the streets and grocery carts rattled along cracked sidewalks, Marcus lived in a square of space barely larger than his father's barracks room. The building was a VA-subsidized complex. Cheap tile, fluorescent lighting, and a faint smell of bleach that never quite masked the mildew. For many, it was shelter. For Marcus, it felt like a bunker that forgot it was supposed to protect. Each morning followed the same ritual. He would lace his boots with the muscle memory of a Marine who had tied them 1,000 times in desert dawns. He would pour cereal that he rarely ate, turn on the television to a military news channel he didn't listen to, and sit at a table scarred with cigarette burns from tenants past. In those moments, the silence was louder than artillery fire. His father's photo on the fridge wasn't decoration. It was surveillance. Every time Marcus looked up, the young man in uniform demanded an explanation he couldn't give. Marcus had returned from 3 deployments with a service record his commanders called solid. He came back with scars no one marked on his file, nights where every creak of the floorboard signaled an ambush, mornings where mirrors reflected a man he didn't recognize. Civilian life was supposed to be easier, but every test, job applications, certification exams, interviews, felt harder than combat. He had failed out of the electrician program. He had dropped from the security officer course. And the most recent assessment for a mechanic's apprenticeship had stamped him with that damning word: failing. Again. Dr. Sarah Jensen, his VA counselor, left voicemails that piled up like unread orders. "You're not weak, Marcus. PTSD is a wound, not a verdict. Let us help you find your footing." He deleted them before they finished. He told himself he wasn't broken, just misplaced, like a soldier ordered to guard the wrong outpost. And then there was Clara. She lived 2 floors down in the same complex, in a unit even smaller than his, with her mother Rosa, who cleaned offices at night and apartments during the day. Clara had hair that refused to stay in neat braids, a backpack frayed at the seams, and a gaze sharper than any officer's inspection. Most kids her age spoke in bursts, fast, impatient. Clara spoke as if every word carried weight. Her voice was soft, but it had edges. Marcus had noticed her before in the community lounge, tucked into corners with books that didn't belong in the hands of an 11-year-old. Rilke, Camus, even a battered copy of Sun Tzu with pages scribbled full of her notes. She read them the way Marines read field manuals, not for beauty, but for survival. When she returned the Rilke book to him that morning, it was the first time he saw her more than a blur in the hallway. She spoke of her abuelo, Miguel Rodriguez, a veteran of Vietnam who had fought at Khe Sanh and come home to a country that forgot him. To Clara, he was more than a grandfather. He was a compass. Before he died, he told her, "The hardest test isn't on a battlefield, it's waking up after one. You either see only ghosts, or you see the reason you survived." Marcus listened, wary. He had heard counselors recite slogans, pastors recite verses, fellow veterans recite platitudes. But Clara's words landed differently. Maybe it was her age. Maybe it was the way her eyes didn't flinch when she said them. She wasn't trying to fix him. She was offering him a lens. Her rules when he asked were simple and absurd all at once. Forget what you think you know about being a civilian. Follow what I say exactly. And most of all, drop the weight you carry about being left behind. She said it with the gravity of someone handing down a military order, except her boots didn't reach the floor when she sat. That was how Marcus found himself standing with Clara in the community garden at dawn, staring at a plot of dirt he had been told to patrol. To his eye, it was just weeds and broken bottles. To hers, it was a battlefield of persistence. She pointed out an ant dragging a crumb double its size, a spiderweb strung like lace between fence posts, a wildflower splitting concrete. "You've been trained to spot threats," she told him. "Now train yourself to spot life." It was ridiculous. And yet, kneeling beside her, Marcus realized he had never really looked at anything without the filter of survival. For the first time, he wasn't scanning for danger. He was searching for meaning. The apartment complex, the failing grades, the suffocating silence of his father's shadow, none of it changed overnight. But in that moment, with Clara pointing at a bloom no bigger than her fingernail, Marcus felt something loosen. It wasn't hope yet, not quite, but it was the first step toward remembering what it looked like. Marcus's first real test came not from a classroom or exam sheet, but from a crowded waiting room at the Portland VA clinic. The air smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, the kind that sat on burners for hours until it tasted like burnt tin. Veterans shuffled in and out, some in wheelchairs, some carrying files thick as dictionaries. The receptionist called names like orders on a battlefield. Marcus sat slouched, his file thin in his lap, a folder that told doctors everything except the truth. He had come reluctantly, prodded by Clara's insistence. You can't see hope if you keep hiding from where you lost it. He had promised her he'd try, though the word try felt like a weak shield. Across from him, two other vets were joking, their voices rough with cigarette smoke. Hey, isn't that Thompson? The Marine who bombed out of the mechanics program? One muttered, not quietly enough. Marcus felt the sting. His failures had a way of spreading, whispered among circles where reputations mattered. He clenched the folder tighter, willing himself to ignore it. The second man smirked. Guy's been given more chances than a cat. Can't even hold down a job interview. Probably just wants another disability check. The words hit harder than incoming fire. He had heard them before, in job centers, from neighbors, sometimes from the harshest voice of all, his own. His jaw tightened. In his mind, he saw himself springing up, fists ready, proving he wasn't weak. Old training stirred. Dominate, don't yield. But then Clara's voice floated back, clear as a command. You've been trained to spot threats. Now train yourself to spot life. Life, not insults, not ghosts. Life. Instead of rising, Marcus stared at the floor tiles until they blurred into patterns. He focused on his breathing, on the small sound of a child's laughter from the hallway. Someone had brought their son, a boy playing with a toy truck in the corner. It reminded him of his own nephew he hadn't visited in months. A reminder that the world outside this room existed, fragile and worth noticing. When the nurse called his name, Marcus stood without looking at the men. He felt their eyes on him, waiting for an outburst, a collapse. He gave them neither. Inside the consultation room, Dr. Jensen adjusted her glasses, scanning his file. Marcus, I see you missed 3 appointments this month, and you failed another certification test. You can't keep avoiding structure. Her tone was clinical, not cruel, but to Marcus it felt like another strike. He wanted to snap back, to insist he was trying, but the words wouldn't come. He thought of Clara again, of her rule. Forget what you think you know. So instead of defending himself, he asked quietly, What do you see when you read that file? Dr. Jensen paused, taken aback. I see a veteran struggling to adapt, someone who might be hiding the severity of his symptoms. And if you looked past the numbers? He pressed, surprising himself. She studied him longer this time. I'd see a man still here, which means he hasn't given up. The admission softened something in him, though her next words reignited the sting. But Marcus, resilience isn't the same as recovery. You need more than stubbornness. The session ended with another pamphlet, another suggestion for group therapy. Walking out, he felt the weight of humiliation pressing down. To the vets in the waiting room, to Dr. Jensen, maybe even to himself, he was a failure. But then he caught sight of Clara sitting outside with her mother's cleaning cart, legs swinging off the bench. You didn't fight them, she said, noticing his clenched hands. They weren't worth fighting, he muttered. Clara smiled faintly. That means you passed. Passed what? the first test, seeing the insult without becoming it. Marcus exhaled, the tension easing just slightly. It wasn't victory, not yet, but for the first time, humiliation hadn't swallowed him whole. And that felt like progress. Night was the enemy Marcus never learned to fight. It ambushed him in silence, invaded through dreams, turned the walls of his apartment into corridors of memory. That night, after the VA clinic, the humiliation still fresh on his skin, he lay on the couch with the lights off, staring at the ceiling fan as it sliced the air. The hum reminded him of helicopter rotors. The shadows reminded him of Kandahar. He drifted into sleep against his will. The desert was alive with sound, boots crunching on gravel, the clipped exchanges of radio chatter, the metallic scent of gun oil. Marcus was 22 again, the youngest squad leader in his platoon, standing outside a mud brick compound under a bruised Afghan sky. The mission had been a simple one: secure, clear, report. But missions were never simple when fear moved faster than orders. They breached. Inside, it was chaos. An explosion thundered, ears ringing, dust choking every breath. Marcus remembered dragging Private Daniels out by his vest, screaming for a corpsman who never came. Daniels bled out before his eyes, his hand grasping Marcus's sleeve until the grip went slack. By dawn, 3 Marines were dead, 2 wounded, and the report filed the action as successful. Marcus had written it himself, the words neat and detached. Objective cleared, resistance neutralized, unit sustained minimal losses. Minimal losses. He woke in sweat, his chest tight. For years, he had told himself those words. They sounded like efficiency, like professionalism, but they were lies. They were a shield that let him march forward while pieces of him stayed behind in the dust. The next morning, Clara was waiting at the community garden. She sat cross-legged, a notebook balanced on her knees, her pencil moving furiously across the page. When Marcus approached, she looked up and saw the exhaustion in his face. "Nightmares again?" she said, not as a question. He nodded. "They don't stop." She tore out a page and handed it to him. A sketch, rough but powerful. It showed a soldier carrying 3 shadowy figures on his back, his knees buckling under the weight. Above the figures, Clara had written, "Not ghosts, responsibilities." "My abuelo told me once," she explained, "that survivors are chosen, not lucky. If you lived when others didn't, you carry them with you. But you don't carry their deaths. You carry what they lived for." Marcus studied the drawing. He thought of Daniels, of Corporal Hughes, of Staff Sergeant Rivera. Their laughter around campfires, their letters from home, their plans for the future that never came. He had carried their deaths like chains. Could he carry their lives instead? Clara began telling him about her grandfather Miguel, her voice soft but unwavering. He had been 19 when drafted to Vietnam, a boy from a barrio in Los Angeles who spoke more Spanish than English. At Khe Sanh, he survived artillery barrages that flattened entire platoons. When he came home, he was met not with parades, but with suspicion, denied disability benefits because paperwork misspelled his name and no one bothered to fix it. "He used to say the war didn't kill him," Clara whispered. "Coming home did. They made him feel invisible. So he taught me never to let anyone tell me my story didn't matter. That's why I read all his books. He wanted me to find meaning, even if the world didn't give it." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but recognition. Miguel's story was his own in another uniform, another war. forgotten, misunderstood, punished not for fighting, but for surviving. Later that week, Clara convinced him to open the trunk at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't touched since his discharge. Inside lay his military gear, a folded flag, dog tags, photos creased from being handled too often. She picked up one, Marcus and his squad standing in front of a Humvee, grins wide, dust caked on their faces. Daniels was in the middle, flashing a peace sign. "You see guilt," Clara said. "I see proof you were part of something bigger than yourself. That doesn't disappear just because you're not in uniform." He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. Every face in that photo had trusted him, and maybe surviving wasn't betrayal. It was the continuation of their trust. That night, he tried something new. When the nightmare came, when Daniel's blood spread dark across the sand, Marcus forced himself to remember the sketch Clara had given him. Not ghosts, responsibilities. He repeated it like a mantra, and slowly the weight in his chest shifted, still heavy, but no longer suffocating. By the end of the month, Marcus began attending group therapy, not because he was forced, but because Clara asked him to listen for the stories. In the circle of folding chairs, veterans spoke of jobs lost, families fractured, addictions battled. Marcus listened, and for the first time, he heard not despair, but the same resilience that had carried them through war. When it was his turn, he spoke haltingly about Daniels, about guilt, about Clara's lesson. Heads nodded. Someone muttered, "I needed to hear that." It wasn't healing, not fully. The nightmares remained, the failures on paper still real. But now, Marcus carried something else too. The voices of the living, the lessons of the dead, and the stubborn faith of an 11-year-old who saw a soldier not as broken, but as unfinished. The library at the VA Center smelled faintly of dust and coffee, a quiet refuge where veterans drifted between old newspapers and pamphlets about benefits most of them never received. Marcus rarely came here. Too many people, too many memories. But that afternoon, Clara insisted. "You've been listening long enough," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "Now it's time to speak." He hesitated at the door, his pulse thudded the way it had before a patrol, the sense that crossing a threshold could change everything. Inside, Dr. Sarah Jensen was hosting an open forum. A dozen veterans sat in a loose circle, some in wheelchairs, others hunched in silence. Most stared at the floor as if afraid their voices didn't matter. Dr. Jensen welcomed him with polite surprise. "Marcus, glad you joined us. We're sharing what we need most right now." One by one, the men and women spoke. A father unable to keep work, a medic who hadn't slept through a night in 10 years, a young woman drowning in hospital bills for injuries sustained in service. Their words fell like stones in a still pond, ripples of pain, but quickly swallowed by silence. Then Dr. Jensen's eyes turned to him. "Marcus, would you like to share?" The old instinct was to shake his head, to retreat into invisibility. But Clara's voice echoed in memory, "Don't carry deaths, carry their lives." He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the stillness. "I used to think survival was weakness," he began, "that because I came home when others didn't, I had failed. Every night I'd see their faces and wonder why I was the one left standing." He paused, meeting the gaze of the medic, the young woman, the father. "But a little girl reminded me that survival isn't guilt, it's responsibility. to carry forward what our brothers and sisters stood for, to live with purpose, even when it feels like we don't have one. The room shifted, heads lifted, the silence became a tension. Marcus continued, his voice steadier now. We were trained to see threats in every shadow. Now we have to train ourselves to see life, to see hope, to see each other. That's how we keep fighting, not with rifles, but with stories, with showing up. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the medic whispered, I thought I was the only one who felt that. Another man said, You just put into words what I couldn't. The circle leaned closer, as if gravity itself had changed. Clara, sitting quietly in the back with her notebook, smiled faintly. She had known he would find the words when the time came. When the session ended, Dr. Jensen approached him, her professional detachment cracked by something warmer. You may not realize it, Marcus, she said, but you just gave them what no medication or program could. Proof they're not alone. Outside, the autumn air was sharp, leaves scattering across the pavement. Marcus stood with Clara at his side. You tricked me, he said with a half-smile. You knew I'd have to speak if you dragged me in there. Clara shrugged. Abuelo always said the loudest battles are fought in silence. Sometimes you just need someone to hand you the flag. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel like a man drifting. He felt like a soldier with a mission, one measured not in victories, but in voices lifted together. The day of the Veterans Town Hall arrived with an edge of cold in the Portland air. The auditorium of the Civic Center was filled wall to wall, rows of folding chairs packed with veterans, their families, city officials, and a handful of reporters. The event was meant to be routine, a panel, a fundraiser, polite words about sacrifice. But to Marcus, it felt like a battlefield. He hadn't planned to speak. He told himself he would just listen, sit quietly in the back, and leave before the crowd surged out. But Clara was there, sitting 2 rows from the front with her notebook open on her knees, glancing back at him. The look in her eyes was the same one Daniels used to give him before patrols. I'm counting on you. On stage, a councilman in a polished suit droned about budget cuts. His words were careful, practiced, devoid of the rawness Marcus knew filled the room. Then the floor was opened for questions. A young Marine in the back rose to his feet, his voice cracking as he said he hadn't been able to afford rent for 3 months despite working 2 jobs. Another veteran, a woman with a service dog pressed against her leg, said her disability claim had been denied for the 4th time. Each testimony was a wound reopened, and each time the officials responded with bureaucratic phrases. We'll look into that. We understand your frustration. Marcus felt his hands tighten into fists. He recognized the tension in the room. It was the same before an ambush, that taut wire of anger and despair ready to snap. Clara's gaze burned into him like a command. He stood. The microphone passed down the row until it reached him. His legs trembled as he rose, but his voice, when it came, was steadier than he expected. My name is Marcus Thompson, Marine Corps, Kandahar, 3 deployments. He paused. The room quieted. I came home, but I didn't really come home. Not for years. I failed every test they gave me, job programs, interviews, therapy sessions. I thought I was broken. I thought surviving when others didn't made me less of a man, not more. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some veterans nodded. Others froze, listening. But then a little girl reminded me of something my brothers died believing. survival isn't shame. Survival is responsibility. We don't carry their deaths. We carry their lives. Every laugh they'll never have, every dream they'll never chase, that's ours to keep alive. His voice rose now, cutting through the silence. And we can't do it by being told we'll look into it or filling out one more form that disappears into a system that forgets us. We need recognition. We need respect. We need each other. The applause began tentatively, one set of hands, then another, but quickly built into a roar. Marcus felt the weight on his chest loosen, not vanish, but shift into something he could bear. From the side of the stage, Dr. Jensen approached him, gesturing for him to join the panel. His instinct was to retreat, but Clara mouthed the words, "Go, now." On stage, under the harsh lights, Marcus faced the officials and the cameras. You want solutions? Here's one. Hire veterans to guide veterans. We don't need lectures. We need someone who speaks our language. We need to see each other not as cases, but as comrades. The councilman tried to interject, but the crowd's thunder drowned him out. Veterans rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, others with fists lifted in solidarity. And then came the moment that seared itself into Marcus's memory. A frail man in a wheelchair, silver hair falling over his forehead, wheeled himself forward. His voice shook, but carried, "For 50 years I've been waiting to hear someone say what you just said, son. 50 years." The room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Photographers' flashes lit the air. Dr. Jensen leaned toward Marcus and whispered, "You just gave them a mission again." But Marcus barely heard. His eyes were on Clara, standing now, clapping with all the force her small hands could muster, tears streaking down her cheeks. Later, as the crowd spilled into the cold night, veterans approached Marcus, shaking his hand, pressing his shoulder, thanking him not just for his service, but for his words. A few asked when the program he spoke of would begin. He didn't know, but for the first time, he wanted to find out. Outside, beneath the flickering street lamps, Clara walked beside him. "You see," she said softly, "you thought you were lost, but you just showed them the way." Marcus looked at her, the girl who had carried her grandfather's lessons into his broken life and handed him back his purpose. "No," he said, voice low but firm. "We showed them, together." And in that moment, with the night air sharp in his lungs and the echoes of applause still ringing, Marcus knew the battle he had been fighting for years was not over, but he finally had the weapon he needed, hope shared, not hoarded. The councilman who had dismissed every plea with polite emptiness still sat stiffly on stage, his tie too tight, his smile frozen. The applause for Marcus had barely faded when the veterans in the audience began to turn their attention to him. "You said we'll look into it," a Navy vet shouted from the back. "For 3 years I've been waiting. Nothing's changed." Another voice rose. "You've got funding for parades, for speeches, but not for our medical bills. Where's the respect?" The officials tried to quiet the crowd, but the momentum had shifted. The room wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the men and women who had carried the scars of service into civilian life. The councilman attempted to retake control. "We understand your frustrations, but these issues are complex." "Not complex," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice calm but sharp. "Neglected. That's the word." The words landed like a gavel. Reporters scribbled faster. Cameras zoomed in on the sweat beginning to bead at the councilman's temple. Dr. Jensen leaned forward. "You've had countless opportunities," she said. "Veterans have been begging for help, and every time they're met with bureaucracy. Tonight, they've spoken for themselves, and you cannot ignore them anymore." The crowd roared in agreement. Then Clara, small but steady, stood from her seat and lifted her sketchbook high. On the page was her drawing of the soldier carrying the shadows of his comrades. "He's not the only one carrying them," she called out. "Every veteran in this room is carrying someone, and you've been asking them to carry the weight alone." Silence fell. The councilman opened his mouth, but no words came. His face paled. In that moment, he was not the authority figure, not the man in the suit. He was the one exposed, revealed as the politician who had failed those who gave everything. The veterans began to chant, not angrily, but with power. "Respect us! Respect us!" The officials were escorted from the stage, not in triumph, but in humiliation, their promises drowned out by the united voices of the men and women. They had failed. For the first time, Marcus didn't feel small under the fluorescent lights of the Civic Center. He felt like a soldier again. But this time, the battle wasn't about enemies abroad. It was about truth at home. The downfall of those who had treated veterans as statistics wasn't marked by violence or vengeance. It was marked by the simple fact that they had no words left to answer. The city lights shimmered on the Willamette River as Marcus walked out of the Civic Center, the crisp Oregon air carrying the echoes of the chants still bouncing in his chest. For the first time in years, his shoulders felt lighter, not because the weight had vanished, but because it was no longer his alone to bear. Clara skipped at his side, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She looked up at him with a seriousness far older than her 11 years. "Abuelo would be proud," she said. Marcus stopped, crouching so their eyes met. "No," he said gently. "He'd be proud of you. You carried his lessons further than he ever could have imagined. You reminded me what surviving really means." Clara's eyes glistened, but she smiled. "Then maybe surviving is enough, if you share it." Over the weeks that followed, ripples spread from that night. Local newspapers ran headlines. "Veterans demand change and find their voice." Marcus was invited back, not as a case study in failure, but as a peer counselor. With the VA's reluctant blessing, a new pilot program began. Veterans helping veterans, guided by shared experience rather than sterile checklists. Marcus moved out of his small apartment into a modest house near the community garden. The first thing he did was clear a patch of earth with Clara, planting wildflowers. "Not patrols this time," he said with a grin, "just life." Every week, veterans gathered at the Rusty Spoke, the bar once haunted by silence and cheap beer. Now it was filled with laughter, photos of the fallen pinned to the walls, and a plaque that read, "We carry them by living." Marcus listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words landed with the authority of someone who had been to the brink and walked back. One evening, as the sun sank in streaks of gold across Portland, Marcus watched Clara run across the garden with other children, her hair catching the light. Rosa sat nearby, her tired hands finally still, pride softening her face. Marcus felt a peace he hadn't believed possible. The nightmares hadn't disappeared. They never would. But when they came, he saw Daniel's grin, Hughes's stubborn courage, Rivera's booming laugh. Not as ghosts dragging him down, but as lives urging him forward. On his kitchen table, beside his old dog tags, lay Clara's sketch of the soldier carrying shadows. Marcus had framed it. Every morning he touched the glass before walking out the door, because now, at last, he knew his mission: not to forget, not to escape, but to carry, and to teach others how to carry too. And in that quiet purpose, Marcus Thompson, Marine, survivor, brother, found the one thing he thought he had lost forever: a future worth living.